So I think, unless I'm mistaken, was anyone not here last week? You weren't here last week. You weren't here. For the two that weren't here, see everything that was on Studio and all of that. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we talked about last week or anything that we covered? We're all good? Okay. So anyone have any reviews for me today? I know I said that you could start them today, but I would be very surprised if anyone absolutely started the reviews today. No one? Okay, good. So we'll get started. Technically, we're supposed to be like 22 in this class, but I think we're going to just be cursed with having 6 less people than we're actually supposed to have consistently. But we'll see. Basically, today, what we're going to be doing is elaborating a little bit on what we started talking about last week, which is to say, starting to think through what exactly we mean by the weird, right? Which is the core topic of our class for this semester. So the plan was to kind of go over the introduction that I asked you to read alongside the 2 creative texts. It's okay if not all of you read the introduction in its entirety. Like I said last week, the priority is always the literary texts, right? So I hope at the very least you all read the Gilman and Poe text. Are we all on the same page on that one? A minimal nod would be okay in this case. Good. Okay. So we're going to cover that. And the reason why I wanted to cover those 2 texts in particular, along with a few other things here and there from the 19th century, even if it's technically a 20th and 21st century literature's class, was in part to see what elements of the 19th century, as far as literature and as far as general society, right, carried over into the 20th and 21st century, right? Because nothing in this world, whether it's literature or society or politics, exists right? Nothing just appears out of nowhere. And so I think it is important to nevertheless start with a little bit of a 19th century idea with a specific focus on what, will carry over into later centuries. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, good. I'm just going to look at my notes real quick to make sure of where I'm going here. Right. Okay, so part of what I wanted to do as well today is give a quick reminder that part of this class is also going to be based around certain literary theories, right, which I brought up last week. Each or most of the classes are going to be focused around reading a text through a specific literary theory. Right? Next week, we're going to be talking about reader response theory, week after structuralism, and so on and so forth. But you may have noticed that there was no specific theory to read for this week, right? And that's kind of where I want to begin today's class, right? It's not with a specific theory, but with a general idea about theory before the 20th century, right? Because it's not true that people didn't have some sense of how to read or analyze a text, right? That's not why I decided to start an examination of 20th century literature and literary theory with the 20th century. There certainly was some before then. But I think it was certainly different before and starting with the 20th century. There was, I think, a significant break in the way that we engage with texts and the way that we analyze and the way that we understand literature starting with the 20th century. Okay? So I wanted to start a little bit with that. So I guess I'll launch a question all to you, right, to get us all started. When we talk about literary criticism and literary theory, right, what exactly do we mean by that, right? Is there a specific definition that we can work with, or is it all just up in the air and no one can agree on it, right? So I'm curious, what do you understand when we say literary criticism or literary theory? And I'm not looking for a specific answer. I'm really just curious what that means to you. Yeah, what's your name, first of all?
Aya.
Aya, okay.
I think it's like employing methods or ideas to try to analyze and legitimate the study.
Okay. Methods and ideas applied to a text. Okay? Do we want to add to that? We all agree without any criticism or extra things. Yeah. What's your name? Maimuna. Okay.
It's being able to analyze the information you're taking in
Uh-huh.
and then draw connections to either like the author's the author's intended message or like other things that you know in general. So making links to like understand like themes, I guess.
So it's not just applying a theory, but actually engaging with it in some kind of critical lens, right? Am I getting that correctly? Right? So we're all people with specific ideas about the world or about what literature can do or various ideas, right? Whether they're connected to literature or not. And we can bring that to a text, right? And that particular aspect, by the way, is going to become very important starting next week, right? That's going to be the real focus of the specific type of theory that we're going to be looking at starting next week, which is called reader response theory. So keep that one in mind, right? But regardless of what category of literary theory we're going with, there is some kind of baggage that we're bringing to it, right? Good. Anything else we want to add to that? It's a good place to start. Now, why start in the 20th century then? Because, who was the first literary theorist, has been the subject of some debate for literally centuries at this point, over a century at the very least. But I think we can create a distinction between the first people to actively think about the power of literature, right, which arguably goes all the way back to Plato, right? Who here has read The Republic? Show of hand. Okay, one person. Really? Just one person? Damn, guys. Okay. You should get on it. It's an okay text. So yeah, it's a pretty good text. It's worth it. But there's a whole chapter, right, where Plato discusses, or he has Socrates discuss through Plato, the power of poetry, right? What that means for his perfect society that he's building. Right? Is that a form of literary theory? Personally, I would say no, but some people argue, yeah, right? Because it does fall into the category of what, Maimuna, you were talking about, of thinking through what the power of literature is, right? And applying it to a specific lens of society, right? So arguably it would be a form of literary theory to some people. For the purposes of this class, right, I'm going to say it's more of what we call literary criticism, right? And I'm going to be distinguishing between literary criticism and literary theory, right? Does anyone want to take a guess at what the difference might be between criticism and theory specifically? Again, not looking for a specific answer. I'm just curious. Remind me your name. Mia, go for it.
It's like a fixed rule.
Okay.
And criticism is one.
Okay, so fixed versus personal. Good. Do we want to add anything to that? I think that's a good place to start, but I think we can develop that a little bit further. When we criticize something, what are we doing versus when we theorize something? Yeah.
Well, when we criticize something, we're we look at the bad aspects. Let's say that the weaker aspects, the bad aspects, and try to give a sort of solution or a betterment, an upgrade, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Like that. Well, in theory, we just talk about it. We just notice it. Mm-hmm. We make note of it, but we don't do anything about it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I think we can work with that, definitely, right? That's not to say that when we criticize something, it's always negative, right? That's not true at all, right? You can be, you take a critical stance on something and kind of like what you were getting at, Adam, yeah. Right? You're kind of elaborating on good, bad, general aspects of a text or anything else, through the lens often of a literary theory. Not always, but often. And I would argue that a lot of these early theory, I'm just looking at my PowerPoint. No, there's nothing about that. That a lot of this early theory, right, literary thought, was much more in the category of literary criticism. And part of the reason why I would say that, right, if we come back to the example of Plato's Republic, right, he's not examining what it means to actually analyze a text in chapter 10 of the Republic, right? he's actually talking about whether or not literature is a good thing aesthetically and socially. That's the entire thing. Ultimately, much to the dismay of a lot of English students afterwards, for those of you who don't know, Plato comes down hard on the fact that no, literature is not a good thing for society, and it ultimately just corrupts the youth. He takes a very conservative approach to it, and it's a bit disappointing from Plato. But this goes on and on throughout the centuries. If we take Plato's student, right, the famous Aristotle, what's one of his most famous works is called the Poetics, right, which on the surface sounds like something that would be a form of literary criticism. If you picked up a work today that was published in 2024 called Poetics, you would assume that it's some kind of analysis of what concretely poetry is, right? What are the mechanisms of different kinds of poetry? But that's not really what that work is, right? Anyone here actually read the Poetics? Yeah, that one's a little, yes? Liam?
The beginning of the lyrics, yeah.
What is it about? Do you remember? No, okay. Basically what it is, right, is Aristotle laying out, right, how you write literary works, right? This is really oversimplifying it for the purposes of this lecture, but he's basically saying this is what goes into a piece of literature, so to speak. And he doesn't use the word literature because the word didn't necessarily exist in ancient Greek, but that's kind of what he's going for. He's setting out, right, what exactly it means to have a character, right, story structure, and different formal elements of a piece of literature. Right? So at the end of the day, what it is mostly an aesthetic roadmap, right? Which, again, you could quibble on whether or not that is a form of literary theory or not, but I think we can all agree it's certainly not a way of analyzing a text. It is a way of writing a text at the end of the day. And I think those are two very different things. Okay? And the reason why I'm spending a little bit of time on Plato and Aristotle, and I don't think I'm surprising anyone here, is that they were huge influences, right? Shocker. They were very influential on a lot of literature, especially in, the broadly speaking Western world, right? That English literature would develop in, right? Especially for most of its history. Today, of course, in the 20th and 21st centuries, English literature would get influences across the world, right? And there's English literature that's made in Nigeria and China, all kinds of places. All kinds of literature written in English, but for a long time, it was a much smaller world that had very specific influences, right? And Aristotle and Plato, some of them. Now, what does this have to do with today's topic, right? At the end of the day, kind of everything. For those of you who may or may not be aware, right, people like Edgar Allan Poe and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who I asked you to read for today, did actively think about the role of literature in society, right? We're going to get to it a little bit later, but Gilman was a very active feminist in her time, right? As you may have noticed from reading the yellow wallpaper, it's filled with feminist topics. 19th century feminist topics, but feminist topics nonetheless. And Edgar Allan Poe, it's perhaps a little bit less obvious in The Fall of the House of Usher, although somewhat. But he was very much concerned with what it was to write in an aesthetic way, right? What it was to write literature. He did write pieces of nonfiction that were very much concerned with, what it meant to think on an aesthetic level. Okay? If anyone is curious, I do have some of those elements here in front. If you want to actually not read through some of them, but get a sense of what some of those are, I'm happy to recommend some a little bit later. But a lot of these ideas, right, that Gilman and Poe were thinking through, right, were again influenced all the way back to those early sources, right? They were still very much beholden to this idea that there was this unquestioned idea of capital L literature, right? And that what mattered is the way that you actually wrote that literature, not necessarily the way that you thought about that literature. Does that make sense, this distinction so far? Okay. Any questions while I take a sip of water before I pass out? No? Okay. Now, just because people like Poe and Gilman were very much influenced by older forms of thinking through literature, like Aristotle, like the Romantics, which we're going to be talking about a little bit, and of course their modern milieu, right, doesn't mean that they themselves did not have an influence on something completely different. And that's really what we're going to be getting at in some way, shape, or form today, right? We're going to be talking about Poe and Gilman. And by the end of the class, right, I think we're going to be able to create some kind of connection. Some kind of connection, right, with already our text for next week, which is Lovecraft. Okay. Has anyone actually started to read At the Mountains of Madness? Just out here. Yeah. Are you already starting to see some of the connections between what you read this week and next week?
Follow what is happening. I'm very
Yeah.
plenty more coming.
Good. That's the best I can say. It's good. That's not to say that it's going to get easier. It will get easier, I think, as you get through the story. But yeah, it is, I think, much like Poe and Gilman. They're not easy texts that we're going to be reading this semester, right? Deliberately so in some ways, right? Poe himself in his text kind of admits right at the start that this is going to be something difficult, in the narrative itself. And I think to create, again, a connection between all these kinds of authors that we're thinking through, they all kind of do that, in a sense. They're kind of reveling in the fact that literature, as an art, can be complex, but still very much enjoyable. So you're not alone. I'll say that, right? It is normal to be a bit lost. It's a feature, not a bug, I'll say. We're going to come back to that catchphrase. That's going to be my catchphrase for the entire semester. It's a feature, not a bug, and do you all actually understand what I'm saying? Right? So those are going to be the two things. Okay. Let me just look at my notes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's go with that. Today we're, as we said, focusing on the 19th century, specifically the end of the 19th century mostly, right? There's all kinds, we can go all the way back to the beginning of literature to find influences on pretty much anyone, any author, but we have to make a cutoff somewhere, so I decided that it was going to be the end of the 19th century. What do we know about the context of the 19th century? Just so I can kind of situate myself about what I say or not in this lecture, right? As specifically as it concerns English literature, right? Or the English literary world. Yes, Adam.
A lot of feminism.
Okay.
Yeah, I know it's a very feministic period. Like a lot of movements were happening at that time.
So it was not just feminism, right? But
One of them. This is one I remember.
So a rather movement-filled right time, right? So feminism is one of them. Again, you can arguably have feminist writers all the way back from centuries, right? There were some proto-feminist writers in the Middle Ages, of course. Christine de Pizan being a rather famous example of that. What other kinds of movements existed in the 19th century that we can think of? Yeah. Okay, good. What did that entail exactly?
Technology, child labor, off of my head.
Yeah. Labor wasn't specific to the Industrial Revolution, but we just shifted the children from the farm to the factory. Yeah. Okay, good. So the rise of the machine, right? In the capital M machine, right? We'll call it that. Absolutely. Again, not specific to the 19th century itself, right? The cotton gin, the invention of the steam engine, right? And the cotton gin started at the end of the 18th century, but it was fully applied on a large scale, right? Starting with the 19th century, right? Absolutely. And this is something that's going to have a huge impact on one of the major literary movements that I highlighted here, right? Which is Romanticism. Anyone here ever take a class on the Romantics? Yeah. If you could give a Cliff Notes idea of what the Romantics project or Romanticist project was, literally speaking, what would you say?
Well, my class was on the birth of like water.
Yeah.
And it was the description of heightened.
So heightened feelings and sensibilities, right? We're going to come back to this in a second. But keep that in mind. Why is that important in a world where industrialization is actively happening, or movements like the feminist movement or workers' rights movements were happening as well, right? Child labor laws were happening, for example. Why would the Romantics emerge in such a period? What's the connection there between those two ideas? Why is that important? This is all relevant, by the way, to our class. This is not just me rambling for 3 hours. This is all relevant. Yeah.
I guess like there was people in general was trying to like Romanticism's goal at that point, I guess, would be like to sensibilize people about like the wrongdoing of like child labor and like how the middle class is treated, how the bottom tier workers are treated, how women are treated unfairly compared to men, etc. So like just kind of a way to sensibilize and like I guess spread the word. Like spread the idea that things need to change.
Okay. I don't know of any Romantic poets that actively spoke about that, right? About that explicitly, right? As far as I know, Percy Shelley never wrote a poem saying like women are cool and they should have more rights. He should have. I'm sure it would have been a really cool poem. But yeah, do you want to add something?
Yeah, to continue on that, again, I'm speaking about England. I think also one of the major aims of education, and especially with like the facilitation of the press and like the printing, like propagated the idea of civilization.
Yeah, so there was a form of civility that was associated with, or like presumed civility that was associated with Romanticism. Absolutely. Anything else we want to add to that? Yeah.
I think it's maybe to really like an escape.
Mhm.
They were like working.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of these three things that we're talking about are actually connected, right? Imagine a world, right, where you go from the 18th century, right, which is by and large still very much a feudal world, right? Most people, right, in the world, and again, we're going to kind of stay to the English-speaking world in this case, but this is pretty much applicable to a lot of places in the world, would have only known a very limited life, mostly stuck on their farm or their piece of land, right, and subservient to some kind of lord, right? That would have been the norm for what had been centuries at that point, and would have still been the norm for most people. There were some people that lived in the cities, but don't think of cities as far as Montreal was concerned. That's not at all the types of cities that we're talking about. We briefly made fun of Shakespeare last week, but he's a really good example. Shakespeare himself, despite writing about the entire things that are in North America, you take The Tempest, for example, never left more than 100 kilometers away from where he actually was born, right? People's lives were very, very limited and focused, right? And suddenly, in the 19th century, you have this explosion, right? Suddenly, you have the printing press, you have industrialization, you have all kinds of movements, which we already talked about, that explode what people's ideas of their lives are, right? Sometimes for the better, right? That means that people have access to all kinds of goods and commodities that they never had access to before. Bless you. But it also creates this very insidious thing, which is an alienation, right, from the world around you, right? If you're spending your life in a factory, right, as a lot of people were in the 19th century, suddenly, well, you start to think that you're quite constrained in your life. Right? And to come back to the Romantics, that's very much what they were pushing against, right? So that's why I was saying, Adam, when you were talking about the movements at the time, even though they were not explicitly talking about these moments, or these movements, they were absolutely channeling an energy and a feeling that wanted to imagine something greater than themselves. Okay? If you're starting to see where I'm going with this in relation to some of the topics that we're going to be discussing in today's either today's lecture or this entire class, right? Imagining something outside of just our individual constraints. Okay? Very important for the Romantics. Okay, I'm just going to pull up an example here. I actually wanted to talk about a different example, but then my partner convinced me not to talk about it because she was going to talk about it in her own class, and so we didn't want to double up because some of you are also taking her class. So if you talk about Mont Blanc in Camille's class, that's the reason why. Okay, so this is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Frost at Midnight. Has anyone ever read that one? Okay. It's a beautiful poem. We're not going to read it in its entirety because it's a little bit long, but I wanted to at least read or have one of you read its first stanza just because I think it starts to show what we're talking about here a little bit. Does anyone actually want to read it? Go ahead.
The frost performed its secret ministry, unheld by anyone. The owlet's cry came loud and hark again, loud as before. The inmates of my cottage, all at rest, have left me that solitude, which soothes abstruser musings, save that at my side. My cradled infant slumbers peacefully. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm, that it disturbed and vexes meditation with strange and extreme silentness. Sea, hill, and wood, this populous village, sea, and hill, and wood, with all the numberless goings-on of life, inaudible as dreams. The thin blue flame lies on my low-burnt fire and quivers not. That film which fluttered on the grate.
Okay. Who wants to paraphrase what that was? What is Coleridge talking about here? What's he saying?
I think it's just like regular life.
In what sense? What do you mean regular life?
Like regular everyday life. Just a peaceful life. Nothing out of the usual.
Okay.
Just with his child sitting next to him. It's sitting his village that all his life. With next to the fire.
So you're absolutely right? He's talking of the world around him and his child, right? In this case, he would have actually been speaking to his baby, who would have been just newborn at that point. But let's push this further. What's some of the linguistic elements of this poem? Right? What are some of the linguistic elements of this poem that get to what we're talking about so far? Yes, remind me your name. Francesca, go for it. Absolutely. And, if we wanted to take an example, he goes on and talks about, there's absolute silence. It's during the nighttime in this case. And this silence, as the world around him is relatively frozen, right? The seas, hills, and wood that are frozen in this winter night, gets at something really interesting with this line, right? It vexes meditation with its strain and extreme silentness. An extreme silentness. What do we make of a line like extreme silentness? Or vexes meditation with its strain and extreme silentness. Yeah.
It's just too quiet.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost uncannily quiet. Right? What he's saying, right, is not that it's necessarily a bad thing, right? As the rest of the poem kind of makes clear, right? He's very much happy in this moment, right, where he gets to be quiet next to his child, next to his sleeping child. But it does get at something that a lot of weird poetry and people like Poe and Gilman would also channel in a very different way, and that is right something that, like we talked about last week, is somewhat natural, right, and yet causes some kind of internal disturbance, right? It's so quiet that it stops him from even thinking because all he can think about is how quiet it is, right? I find it particularly beautiful. I see by some of the looks on your faces that you're looking at me like I'm insane, perhaps, but I don't know. Coleridge is my dude, so I'm gonna love it in this case. Does this make sense to everyone so far, what we're talking about? Right? These influences that we're getting at? Yeah? Okay. I could spend an entire class talking about how cool the Romantics are, but we're not going to do that because we have other stuff to do. Okay, I wanted to go to the last line, to the last stanza. I'll read this, but it just goes to complement what we were already talking about, right? Therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee, whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the red breasts sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the nigh thatch smokes in the sun thaw, whether the eave drops fall, heard only in the trances of the blast, or if the secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. Now, again, we're not going to have a chance to read the entire poem, but basically what happens is that he extends his mind right past his individual self, right? This alienated modern self, right? To come back to something we briefly spoke of last week, and kind of extends it into these various beautiful elements like the apple tree or the slightly melting icicle, right? That's just above a dying fire. And what that line refers to at the end, right, shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon, is him even going as far as an extra earthly, right, kind of transcendence in this case. So again, people like Coleridge or any of the other Romantics were not explicitly thinking of this along the terms that we are going to be doing so in the class, right? Or that Poe was thinking of, or Gilman was thinking of, or any of the others. But you start to see, right, with the advent of 19th century modernity, this willingness to think in a literal sense, right, outside the box, right, and outside of ourselves, that I think is very important to keep in mind. Yes, Adam.
There's an aspect of existentialism here, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Say more about that.
Just because people are trying to question their existence, like they're thinking out of the box, we said.
Mm-hmm.
But like instead of just seeing everything they've known the whole time, like their entire lives, and everything they've seen around them, they try to just start to imagine and like to learn a bit more within Romanticism, but like what's outside of their view, what exists out there.
Yep. Absolutely. Right. What exists out there? For most of human history, right, when we were asking what exists out there, what would have been the answer to that question, whether it's specific to the English-speaking world or any other place? Yes, Maeva.
It's empty because at the time, or beyond, they were still believing that the Earth was flat. So
that's a bit of a misnomer. A misunderstanding of the past. Most people after the Greeks would have thought that the Earth was flat. That idea that Christopher Columbus realized that the Earth was round is a myth. So most people wouldn't have believed the Earth was flat at the time. Maybe a few people, but not really. But okay, so avoid. You had your hand up.
Alice. So God.
God would have been one of them. Adam, is that what you were going to say?
No, ocean.
Ocean.
There's a lot of water.
Yeah. So, but whether it's a void, water, or God, right? Capital G God or small g gods, plural, right? Whatever, depending on the culture you're from in this case. There's something there, right? Something out there that is somewhat tangible for a lot of people, right? And despite our very modern criticisms of things like religion, right? It served a really great purpose for a lot of people, right? We're not going to talk about him in great detail today, but I do have a whole module planned on his thoughts. But what's the famous Karl Marx quote about religion? Everyone knows it today, I'm sure. Something related to drugs.
Oh. I don't know in French, say l'opium du peuple.
Yeah, it's literally the same thing in English.
I've never heard it in English.
Anyone want to say it in English?
Opium of the people.
Opium of the masses is the original. But what did he mean by that, right? It's not that it was a bad thing, right? It's that it made people feel good, right? Because we have to remember at the time, opium was a medicine, right? There are derivatives of opium today that are used in medicine, but it was explicitly a medical practice at the time, right? That's where laudanum was. It was literally a mix of opium and alcohol, which is the greatest mix that you could possibly have, I guess. But what he's getting at in this case is the fact that you want to actually extend yourself beyond that because it reassures you about the world, right? Yes.
That also makes you dependent.
It also makes you dependent, but people were not thinking of that at the time. Yeah, no one would have necessarily thought of in that case. Even Coleridge actually was heavily addicted to laudanum, and to the point that it ruined his poetic career. But even then, no one necessarily thought of it as an addictive problem. It was an individual problem rather than a drug problem. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up religion in this case, what happens with the 19th century, right? For centuries, right, people believe in some form of other being, right? God or whatever you want. What happens in the 19th century? What starts to shift? It's related to what, Francesca, you were talking about earlier.
I'm not sure, but I think in England the church was separated.
That was before the 19th century, but it's very much starting that movement. Yeah.
The involvement of the level of more advanced technologies.
Yeah, so you missed that part, but that's what Francesca was talking about, is the development of industry. Now, what does that have to do with religion? How does that impact the world around us if we live in a heavily industrialized world? Yeah.
Just less need for religion? Because with the industrialization, because now they have more access to the things that they didn't have to before, and even with the steam engine and all that, now people can actually travel, and they don't have to just wonder what's out there and like listen to religion, the stories of religion, etc.
Yeah.
And like to fill their mind, because now they can actually go there.
Good.
And actually hear like real, like people actually talk about it.
Yeah. Excellent. Yes, Francesca.
I guess there's also a lot of people, because there's a lot of, because of the industrialization, life is a bit like hell for a lot of people. And because of that, a lot of people are questioning the fact that they have to work in their living life to go to paradise in that, I guess. Or I don't know if people are still questioning that.
Yes, absolutely. Right. What all of you are bringing up is a really good point, right? People fundamentally are starting to question the validity of these religious ideas, right? As the world gets literally, well, I'll say figuratively smaller, right? As less and less is known about as more and more is known about the world, we have less of a need for imagining something outside of it, right? And as people are increasingly finding new forms of suffering in pretty terrible conditions, right? We like to complain about our work conditions today, but like it's nothing compared to a 19th century child-filled factory, right? Of course. But like people were genuinely questioning, right, whether or not such a thing as a god was around them. And you know, to come back to that Marx quote earlier, right, that's kind of what he was getting at, right? People were starting to lose faith in all kinds of extra human powers in some way, shape, or form. But at the same time, that's what allowed them to move forward in many ways. And to come back briefly to the Romantics, that's a big part of what they were channeling in their literature. A lot of them were profoundly and devoutly atheistic, right? Shelley, Byron, all of these people did not believe in God, right? And they actively went against the idea of a God. But they still channeled, right, what could be very broadly considered something otherworldly as a power, right? We saw a little glimpse of that in Frost at Midnight, right, with the speaker of the poem, which is pretty much Coleridge, right, extending himself past his own body in a very religious type of way, right? But it's a non-secular type of mysticism that he's channeling, right? So this, right, is an explicit part of the project of modernity that is found in a lot of literary practice at the time, and that we should keep in mind as we're going into the 20th century, right? It's something that is slowly being lost on a concrete level, right? People don't believe in a being like God, but they still feel the need for something other than themselves, right? Beyond themselves. Okay? That is extremely important for a lot of people, right? And that's one of the major critiques of modernity that a lot of people have, right? Is that, to quote the famous Nietzsche quote, God is dead, right? But what did we replace him with, right? For a lot of people, nothing, right? And in many ways, someone like Lovecraft, which we'll start talking about next week, tries to fill in that gap, right? In a horrifying way, by the way, right? It is profoundly terrifying what he does in his literature, but he is channeling a very specific moment in time, right? Classic question. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Is everyone clear about how that fits in with the literary project of the 19th century so far? Okay. Any questions or anything we want to add about that? Awesome. Let me look real quick at my notes. Okay, so it's currently 11:15. I wanted to take a break in a few minutes, right? As we usually do every hour or so. I'm going to take a 5-10 minute break, however we need. How many of you, just a show of hands, read the introduction by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer? That was also assigned for today. Okay, so a couple of people. Okay. Before we take a break, I wanted to come back to something that we talked about last week. Let me see if it'll work here. I tested it before class. It should work. Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about the China Meeville afterword, which I messed up on, right, and only gave you a part of it, but we still managed to talk a little bit about some of his text, right? So before we take a break, I want to come back to that and a little bit of the introduction that we read for today. Okay? And then we'll take a break and come back and talk about Poe and Gilman. So, who can remind us what Meeville's definition of the weird was that we talked about last week? Okay. We talked a little bit about it. What do we remember from it? Or is it already way gone in our mind? Take a shot in the dark. What was his whole idea behind it? He made a bit of a linguistic shift, right? And he was talking about, right, dictionaries and so on. Francesca?
Gaps like what's at the forefront and tells us itself.
Okay, right? So when we say gaps, right, it's not evident, right? Good. And the story comes out of that gap, is what you were saying?
Not necessarily it tells in itself, but
Okay.
it could be an allegory, first level, then the story.
Right. So the story in itself, from the gap, we'll say, just to really put it in a note form. Okay. What else do we want to add here? Yes, Adam.
Reading between the lines.
Okay, good.
Just reading between the lines to see like the hidden context of the word, of the words or the meaning, or to actually attribute to it.
Good. I'm not going to have enough room to write meaning here, but you get the drift. Great. What else? Think back to what we were thinking as far as the title is concerned, right? Worm-eaten dictionaries. Efficacy. What else was he getting at? We had a bit of a discussion on that. Or rethink about it now if you don't remember. We talked very briefly, right? To expand on what we just said here, that there is, very much at the heart, at least according to Meeville, at the heart of weird fiction, there's a linguistic practice, right? So I'll write that here. Linguistic practice, right? There's a manipulation of words that happens, right? Thinking through what our reality means or how we understand our reality. That's why he was using the imagery of a dictionary, right? A dictionary is meant to be a holder of knowledge, if we'll recall. And, the worm-eaten part, right, is to show these gaps in knowledge, right? And how sometimes, right, as we mentioned here, sometimes we can create new knowledge from the destruction of something else, right? So I'll write that here. New knowledge in destruction. Now, for those of you who read the brief introduction, the more lengthy introduction by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, did we get anything else from their definition of weird fiction? And again, this is just to establish a few key points that we can work with the texts later. So I'm not looking for a huge in-depth analysis here, just the key points. Maybe look in the first part of the introduction if you have it with you. Yeah. Remind me your name, Minnie.
Supernatural is, but it's not specifically scale or horror. It just has a really weird vibe to it.
Good. This is something that Mieville didn't bring up explicitly, right, in his own text, but that we got at when I was introducing the topic, right? We're not dealing here with monsters, right? Without the Ghosts is a really good part to this edition here. I'm just going to lift this up. Good. Yes?
The characters find themselves in a place, like an unusual place, where like there's like weird vibes going on.
Okay, good. We'll get back to the idea of place. Some of you might be seeing some connections here for today, right? Unusual place, and both of you brought up the idea of, vibes that are creepy or off. Okay, good. Anything else? This is really good so far. How do we establish a creepy vibe? Like when we say something is off, how does that work? Right? Do they kind of go into that? Yeah.
Oriented, whatever makes you feel this people. House and Russia when he was describing little by little how the house was and how he was treated. He was coming into the house and how he saw his childhood future and the way he looked. All this.
Okay, yeah. But what you're getting at in this case is a kind of excess of detail, right? But is it always an excess of detail? Yeah. Okay.
It can also be a lack of.
Good. Sensation is good. We'll come back to that. Or a lack of detail. Adam, what were you going to say?
Well, there was at the start a lot of detail, focus like the vegetation around the house, how the water, the forest, and all of that. But by the end, there was just no mention of it.
Okay, good. So there's a shift at some point. We're going to, again, come back to that. That's very good. Francesca, do you have your hand up or you? Okay. What do you mean by sensation? How do we get that sensation?
They just can't really their hand on.
Good. So usually it is the character, which of course, usually the main character is, a stand-in for what we're supposed to feel, right? Usually you're, as a reader, supposed to feel the same thing or something akin to a similar feeling as the main character. So the character feels something, right? Good. Someone had their hand up. Sorry. Yeah, Adam, go for it.
Something feels off.
Okay, yeah.
But
so
they can't put their finger on it. Something feels wrong.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, excellent. Anything else we want to add to this? Yeah.
Here it was like both of the main characters were in a place. Everybody else was like, I wouldn't say acting right, but they were acting like there was nothing wrong. Like they didn't feel anything, and that person, the main character, was like, something's not right. But then everybody else around them didn't like. It didn't seem like they were understanding. It's as if they were like okay with what was going on.
So there is something related to place in a lot of weird fiction, right? And the Vandermeer introduction does kind of point to that, even if they don't develop it a whole lot. But it can either be completely normal for some characters, or, as you were saying, right, maybe unusual, maybe not. It depends, and that's kind of like the source of the weirdness, right? Is that what you're getting at, in a way?
Well, I was trying to explain, like, it's like as if there was a place that was like already established.
Okay.
And it was like the way of doing things was already like established, and the main character was put in that place, and we didn't understand like the way things happen.
Mm-hmm.
But the characters around them, like it seems like they do.
Okay, right. So it's only unusual for the main character in a sense. Okay, good. Yes, Francesca. Good. Yeah. So isolation is definitely some part of it. Okay. This is going to be really important for not just today, but in the coming weeks. Anything else we want to add? Yeah.
Like, if you're alone, like not just like physically alone, And I feel like mentally, like everybody else is separated from their mental state.
Good.
Like especially in the yellow wallpaper, like nobody believed her the entire time. So she just went a bit cuckoo.
Okay, good. Excellent. So it's both psychological and physical horror or isolation. Excellent. Yes, Francesca.
Illness, whether it's psychological or
Good. Right.
or psychological.
Has anyone ever taken, she retired now, did anyone ever have a chance to take a class with Professor Carolyn Brown before she retired? Yeah. Did you talk about madness? And she often did with her classes. Yeah, good. Yeah, again, this might be something that would be interesting for those of you who are taking reading fiction. That could fit in. A lot of this could fit in with your reading of Frankenstein if you're doing that. But of course, I wouldn't qualify Frankenstein as weird fiction necessarily, and you can maybe think through why that is. Right? Anything else? This is all really good so far. Okay, I see the time. I know some of you probably want to take a break. So, what do we say? 10 minutes or so? Take a minute, take 10 minutes to stretch your legs, go get some water, something like that, ask any questions. When we come back, we're going to talk specifically about how all that we've talked about in this first hour connects in some way, shape, or form to Poe and Gilman. Okay? So be prepared for that. And yeah, that's it. We'll come back in 10 minutes. So, as we were discussing in the part of class, it's something that you should generally pay attention to, and this is not specific to 20th and 21st century literatures. I'm mentioning this as part of this class, but I think as literary students in the making, is something that you should increasingly start to pay attention to are the connections that exist in literary practice and literary creation, right? And a really good example of this, outside of the literature, has anyone actually seen the latest Nosferatu movie? Yeah, what'd you think of it? Was it good? Yeah, I liked it. Anyone else see it? Yeah, you also liked it? Yeah, it's a really good example, right, of the kind of connections that can be made right throughout history and literary history across different mediums, right? Does anyone know? Has anyone seen like the original one from the 20s? Yeah, you saw the original one, but not the new one. So, wow, I think you're the only person in this generation that has actually done this. Okay, but do you know where the original one comes from? Like, what spawned the original? Yeah.
Like an off-brand Dracula.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, exactly. Right. So they wanted to make an adaptation of Bram Stoker's classic novel Dracula, and they ended up instead remaking the vampire genre and doing something completely different with Nosferatu. And you're right, there was like a whole legal thing behind it. But it is rather interesting to consider the remake that was just made, right? In the sense that it became its own thing, right? Its own off-brand Dracula, to put it in your words. But in the remake ended up being somewhat closer to the original Dracula in many ways, right? It added a lot of the sexualized elements of the original Dracula novel that had been completely removed from the 1922 version because it was the 1920s and nothing was allowed to be sexual in Hollywood. But so they reintegrated a lot of those elements that come straight up from the literature, right? And of course, I'm not saying that because of that, it's entirely derivative, right? I think it's its own original piece of art in many ways, and a really good piece of art at that. But it does demonstrate how these literary influences and artistic influences come and go across time and space, right? Going from the 19th century to the early 20th century into the 21st century, harkening back to the 19th century. And I think, thinking of this example is a really good way of understanding a bit of what literary creators or writers do in referencing and channeling other artists and other works, right? And again, this is not particular to the time period that we're talking about. To come back to like just the fetish example that we're going to have throughout this class, it's well known that Shakespeare himself just pulled from all kinds of historical sources, right? And other literary sources in what today we might call plagiarism, but at the time was just called artistic creation. And, that's not to remove at all from the value of those pieces of work, right? But what's important to consider is what we do differently or what it means to reinterpret these moments in a completely different context, right? To come back to the example of Nosferatu, which I guess is as good of an example as any, even if I don't think falls into the category of weird fiction, because it explicitly features a monster like Dracula, like a nondescript Dracula. But what's happening here is not just a reinterpretation of the character, right? But you may notice if you actually watch the movie, it also reimagines, right, the potential for emancipatory movements, right, at the time in like the Victorian era that the movie takes place in, right? Which is rather interesting. And you start to see this as a very interesting trend, I think, in Hollywood. One that I'm not sure is done for the right reasons, but is interesting to think of nonetheless, where filmmakers are increasingly using the 19th century as a way to talk about emancipatory politics, instead of actually setting things in the 21st century because it creates a distance, right, between the politics that they're talking about while still talking about rather contemporary issues. So there's a really interesting move going on here that I think is worth highlighting. Okay, now let's actually talk about the literature. Enough rambling on my end. Some of the things that for the rest of today's class I want to think through are, of course, just the literary elements of the stories that I asked you to think about today, but also based off of the definitions that we kind of broadly discussed before the break, based off the Vandermeer introduction as well as the Mieville text that we talked about last week, right? Whether these stories or not actually can be considered weird fiction as we're developing throughout this class. I would say I'm willing to be convinced that they are, but I don't currently think that they are. And I think it'd be interesting to kind of think through why or why not. Okay? So I'm just going to pull up my notes here, my other notes. For each class, I have like 3 different documents of notes. And okay, good. Now, these texts, right? The Fall of the House of Usher and the Yellow Wallpaper have generally fallen for most critics into the category of what we call Gothic literature, right? Which I think is generally fair. And despite the fact that in the first half of class we mostly talked about Romanticism as a major influence, right? There's another connection that we can make, right? By the end of the 19th century, writers are less concerned with the Romantic, right? There is the emergence of the American Romanticists by the end of the 19th century, but let's be perfectly honest, the British Romantics are far superior to the American Romantics, so we're just going to talk about the British Romantics in this case. And what broadly replaces Romanticism as a literary movement is what we call Gothic literature. Okay? Does anyone want to take a stab at defining Gothic literature? Whether it's based off of this or anything else? Yes, Alice?
Like the dark topics, they're not like this, like mental illness.
It's broadly dark topics, right? Okay, yeah.
Unconventional topics.
Unconventional, good. Okay, such as?
Going into specifically morbid descriptions of the form, so like murder, going very much into detail of this stuff. But I'm pretty sure, let's say, detective novels, all the stuff like that, just usually they didn't go into that much detail.
Yeah.
They went more into the mystery aspect, which of course is good, but they didn't go into the deal with murder and all that.
Yeah, and yet the detective novel very much began in the Gothic, right? Where arguably Poe wrote the first detective novel, or detective story, rather, right? With the invention of Auguste Dupin, right? Who some of you might have read in Murders on the Rue Morgue. Very disappointing story, but still very innovative in many ways in its innovation of a genre, right? Of detective fiction that would, of course, be elaborated on with what's his face, who made Sherlock Holmes, Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle, and many others, right? Raymond Chandler and so on. But of course, as you're pointing to, right, the detective fiction, while obviously featuring an element of crime and terror, right, because the detective has to figure something out, right, the Gothic does take it one step further, right? There is an element of crime, but we're not just using the crime, whether it's a murder or anything else, as a way to kick off the plot, but it's almost like the horror element is the plot itself, right? We want to elaborate on what creates that horror in many ways. Okay? And again, we can think of modernity, broadly speaking, as being one of those things that allows writers like Poe or others to actively think about this in further ways. It's modernity, to put it in the terms of someone like Theodore Adorno, who would be a great critic of modernity. was very much interested in modernity as a qualitative way of understanding the world, right? Rather than a chronological category. And so what he means by that is it's very much, when we talk about modernity, it's something that, I'm losing my words because it's Friday afternoon. So modernity is one of those things that is meant to evoke a particular rational but also alienated type of feeling for a lot of people, as we kind of discussed in the first part of class. And Adorno is getting at that with his notion of it being a qualitative rather than a chronological category. And I think a lot of Gothic fiction also addresses that, right? In a world where we're increasingly thinking of ourselves as very rational and very logical beings, right? Children of the Enlightenment, so to speak. The Gothic is there to say, no, there's still some fucked up things in the world, right? To put it bluntly, right? And that's why we develop ghosts and vampires and other types of things. Okay? These monsters that are there to disrupt the normal world. Okay? Of course, Dracula would disrupt sexual norms because that's what that novel is about, that and colonialism. But ghosts can, of course, disrupt other things. Ghosts disrupt history. Ghosts disrupt our understanding of community bonds or family bonds, and so on, right? And this, again, goes back very, very, very far. There have been ghost stories forever, but the Gothic really delves into those elements in, I think, innovative ways. Okay? Good. Are we all okay on that? Awesome. Do we want to start with Usher or the yellow wallpaper? What do we want to do first? Usher? All right, cool. Get Usher out. How did we find Usher? Good, bad,
For me, I think it was easier to read than the yellow. He was really like this every time to focus on the.
Good. Do we all agree? Did anyone dislike Usher? It's okay if not. Okay. Who wants to take a shot at what the story was? What's the story of Usher? Of the fall of the House of Usher, rather. Not the story of Usher as a character. Yeah.
I don't know about that. Do you want us to describe the underlines or the just
In 2 sentences, what happens in the story? It's not an easy
death.
Okay. Not 2 sentences, but okay, close enough, right? So death is of course a major part of it, and you're right. But let's push this further. And it's not an easy question. Right? I think the very nature of the story kind of goes against a very easy way of understanding this. Hence why I'm asking the question. Yes.
Well, the quick plot summary, like the narrator visits his friend who's going for a rough patch, to put it very mildly, and then while he stays there, his friend's sister dies. And then she comes back to kill him, and then the house gets eaten by water.
Does it get eaten by water? Well, kind of. Yeah. Okay. So, do we want to add to that? Guy visits friend. Friend goes crazy. Wife comes back from the dead. Sister. Sorry, sister comes back from the dead. I say wife because it's implied that there's a bit of between the. Yeah. We'll come back to that if we want. But there's but it's sister. Comes back from. The dead. Doesn't come back from the dead, but never was quite dead to begin with. And the house collapses. Great. Yeah, Alice, were you going to add something? Okay. Anything else we want to add? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's like an element of terror because he thinks that the house is haunted. I think he's just like scared of everything that.
Okay. Let's start right there. If you have your copies of it, this is literally the first paragraph that I'm looking at right here. Let's see. Yeah, first paragraph. I'm about halfway through the first paragraph. No, let's start 5 lines. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half pleasurable, because poetic sentiment, with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terror. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the near house, and the simple landscape features of the domain upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping of the veil. We'll stop there. What do we make of this first passage? Right? Opens up the line. Yeah.
I'm not answering your question, but is this different than the one we put on Studio?
Do you have a different version?
Like, it's like the whole.
You have different.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, like yours is like so detailed and
Yeah.
it's not like
Where they get
short.
forward like a kid.
Yeah.
It was 17 pages, I think.
Are you kidding me?
Like I was reading it and I was like, I'm missing something.
Yes,
It didn't feel familiar.
Yeah, at the beginning we followed you, and then after that, different words.
Seriously?
One thing you're saying another thing.
Like,
I think from now on, what I'm going to do, because I'm just assuming that these are the same versions that I'm putting up online, as you can tell, from my complete and your complete lack of understanding of each other. What I'm going to do is probably just scan the versions I have, or just use the versions that we have here. Hold on. I have it here in my own stuff. This is so far going really great as a class. Really couldn't be better. You must think I'm a complete lunatic. No, this is not the right thing. Week 2. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
It was a dark and soundless. Okay, well you got it here. Okay. Okay, it was a general idea. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm just looking very quickly. Okay. So, nevertheless, with this first-ish paragraph that we're dealing with, right? What are some of the things that come out to you, right? With whether the version you have or the more intense version, perhaps that I described, right? What comes out at you? What are some of the things that are to be highlighted here, and why? Yeah, and then Alice.
Things felt like, and a few dead trees. Things felt like unnaturally like dead, not alive, like empty of life, greenery. Since it's the end of the year, it's the end of something.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, hold on to that. What were you gonna add?
For me, it was like as soon as he got like to the destination, there was like a sense of dread that like enveloped him, and then from then on, he was just like not feeling well, sensing like some
Absolutely, yeah.
place. It still inspires like a lot of.
It's almost like the lack of it being alive is what you're all pointing to, right? It is very dead, right? Just looking at the version that you got, use of terms like cold, heavy sadness, right? Sickening of the heart, dead trees, right? All of these, right, by definition, are an antithesis to any kind of life, right? And yet, together, right, as we're putting all of these terms, in one sentence, almost one uninterrupted sentence, right, it becomes alive by its very literary practice. Okay? Poe is really a master of description, even though he's not actually saying anything remarkable. Right? When you break down, right, it's one paragraph that has 2, maybe 3 sentences to it, right? It's very long paragraphs. At the end of the day, if we wanted to break it down, what is he saying? The house is collapsing, right? That's it, right? He arrived at his friend's place and it looks like a shithole, right? It looks terrible, right? That's all he's saying, right? And yet, the way that it's put together indicates something much more sinister. Okay? What is that sinister thing, right? Is there anything that we know in the story that makes the house sinister? Like, does he ever come out and say, like, this is the root problem of the house and why it looks sinister? At least not in the version I have, but as far as I know, it shouldn't be in your version either, right? There shouldn't be anything that really indicates, right?
It's implied but it's not specifically said.
What's implied and how?
That the house, like itself inside the house,
Mm-hmm.
it feels empty. It feels old, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Good.
even when they went to put the sister's body in the what the way I forgot to call them, the mark,
Oh, and like the
drawer, let's say.
yeah.
The drawer, like even that it felt very like it's a cold atmosphere, just
Mhm.
very, very cold inside. Just something not it doesn't feel homely.
Okay. Anything else we want to add to that? Yeah.
And of the family,
Mhm.
at the same time as dear.
Did anyone else get that? What does the House of Usher refer to? Yes. Uh-huh.
But at the same time, the place where they live. So let us say it's like I don't know. I was in autopilot. I was actually
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I really did pay attention, but I think in a way, if I remember, there was a part that was describing this sort of parallel, like the family, the history of the family, the whole generation, the origins, say, of the Husher family, like the remaining of the Husher family.
Yes. So house, for those of you who don't know, in English has a dual meaning, right? We hear it now in contemporary English. It's mostly used to refer to like aristocratic families, for example. The House of, what's the one at the head of England now? Windsor? House of Windsor, right, is the current monarchical family at the head of the United Kingdom. A bunch of incest babies, right, basically ruling over the United Kingdom, but we refer to them as a house, right? But also there is the very literal establishment where people live, right? A house. So we don't, to come back to that original question, we don't necessarily know what's making the structural house collapse, right? But if we think of the more familial term of house, right? The House of Usher as in the people, right? Do we have any indication about what's making that collapse, right? Yeah. Okay, no air. Good. Yeah.
What did you say it again?
No air. So no.
Before that, what was the question?
Oh, so we don't know concretely what's making the building collapse,
Yeah.
but do we know what's making the familial house, quote unquote, collapse, right? So she said no air.
Then probably the degrading mental the head of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's clearly like mentally unwell, and as it goes on, it becomes like less and less actually cognitive, and just in figuratively literally the house collapses after the friend leaves,
Mm-hmm.
but figuratively the family's done. There's no one left.
Good. Absolutely. Francesca?
Well, I think I have the same verse as you.
This one?
But at the beginning, there's a letter that the writer spoke of acute bodily illness.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be supposed that because of genetic illness.
What's the genetic illness?
Very impressed.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me find it. This might not have been in your version.
No.
Of course it
I
was.
just meant that they had like a tight relationship because they're twins.
Yeah.
I think that's not where it went for Britain.
Let's see. I have. I'm looking for the passage here. Yeah. Okay. So this might be slightly different in your version. This is maybe about halfway through the story. For me, yeah, more or less halfway through the story. Do you have a passage that starts having deposited our mournful burden upon Cressels or something like that? Just after having deposited. Let's see if you have a similar passage. Lady Madeline. No, maybe not. But basically, this is after they bury, right, Lady Madeline. And in my version, there's a passage, right, that indicates these more incestuous elements, right? A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention. And Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Okay.
I think that was at the start of part 2.
Yeah, so that's very possible.
Yeah.
So this is something that even if you had the more formal version, there's a footnote here. Is it possible for a brother and sister to be identical twins?
No.
Logically speaking, not really. Like you can be, you can have a resemblance, but to be like fully biological identical, not really, right? And that's the implication of incest in this case, right? Is that the family is so inbred that everyone looks like everyone else, right? To a point that it's uncanny, right? I'm sorry? Yeah, sickly.
Well, unintended because when we do ancestral experience.
No, absolutely, right? It is sick in like the standards of, well, pretty much everyone. I don't think anyone would be like, yes, this is entirely normal. Or very few people would be like that. But right. But there's also the sickly element in the sense that often what happens in families that feature a lot of incest is what exactly? What happens often to a lot of those families? Yeah.
Just die out.
Usually die out, but there are also often congenital diseases that develop, right, in some way, shape, or form, and which leads to often death. But right, and again, to come back to like the royal element of it, you see this throughout aristocratic history, right? Children or people born in families that have either some kind of deformity or some kind of issue that's health related, and in part it's because of this, right? It's because of intermarried families. So that's definitely something that's implied in this story here. Okay. Good. So obviously we're not going to be able to talk about every single aspect of Usher. As you can see from my version, I took like heavy notes throughout. Okay. So anything else? So I mentioned the first paragraph here, but I'm curious if there are any other passages for you all that stood out to you as particularly noteworthy as far as our discussion is concerned. We'll go from there. Yeah.
I think probably the time where the friend starts reading the stories to Usher and like to calm him down.
Good.
Like it felt very, very eerie. Like this whole scene.
Mm-hmm.
I liked it a lot.
Good. So say more about that. Do we all know what we're referring to in this case? So this was in your version as well.
Yeah.
The narrator, who does he have a name?
No.
You don't know.
I think just
Just I, in this case, is the guy. He reads stories, right, to Roderick to calm him down. What can we say about those stories, right, that he reads to Roderick? What are they like? What makes them eerie? In what way does it perhaps mirror the story that's being told by Poe? Right? Hint, hint. Think through that. What are some of the elements that I'm looking for it in my own text here, but why are the stories within stories important?
I'm not sure about this because I honestly can't remember, but I think he was referring to the end of the story where Mr. Usher was in a panic. And his friend started to read him a story, and the same thing that was happening in the story, was like hearing the same thing in the background.
Exactly.
Parallels.
That's exactly what we're talking about. Why does Poe do this? Why is this important to the story he's telling? Yeah.
Just put an emphasis of like the effects of like what he's reading, like what he's really becoming what's happening in real life. Just enhances the effect of what's about to happen. Like especially if like when the sister like actually knocks on the and Usher like becoming less like more and more like focused in his own world, like in his own like mumbling insane stuff. To reach to the climax with the sister coming in and all that stuff happening.
Yeah. Good. So yes, go ahead, Alice.
Just want to say, for me, I think it was more like, because throughout the story, we think the house is haunted. So that's like when he's reading the story, we just like think that it's like spirits or like whatever. Yeah. Then at the end, we realize it was.
Right. If it wasn't spirits, what was it? The sister. Good. Thank you. Okay. So this passage here in your version does get at the heart of it. Someone who hasn't spoken yet, do they want to read this out? There's a really interesting line at the end in particular, but I would like someone to read this. Someone who hasn't spoken. What's your name with the yellow shirt in back? Yeah. Lincia, do you want to read? No? Okay. Someone else. Come on. Go for it. Thank you, Sue.
After the hours I spent with the master of the House of Usher, yet I would fail in any attempt to give an idea of the true character of the things we did together. There was a strange light over everything. The paintings which he made me tremble. Though I know not why, to tell of them is beyond the power of written words. If ever a man painted an idea, that man was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, there came out of his pictures a sense of fear and wonder.
What is the key element of this passage? Why does this passage matter? Yeah.
For this sense of fear and wonder. Well, I don't know if I don't really understand.
You're on the right side.
Wonder itself is a mix of like when you see something very like out of this world, that leaves you in a space of awe, but which here is a bit contradictory because they brought fear and like I don't know. I don't think that normally fear because it's contradictory.
So what you're pointing to again is a really interesting thing that today in 21st century English, we tend to associate wonder with more of a positive feeling, right? And rightfully so. That's how language changes over time, right? But as this passage does aptly point to, right, wonder is associated here explicitly with a terrifying sensation, right? A literal feeling. Right? And we need to remember that at this time, wonder was not explicitly a positive sentiment, right? It does point rather to what you're talking about, the sense of otherworldly imposition, so to speak. Something crawling into the mind of the narrator and saying, whether it's fear or some other idea, that's actually giving him pause and saying, I need to consider this much further. Okay? But that's actually not the passage I was referring to. There's something else that's really interesting about this sentence. Yeah.
Created an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's not really about.
Right? The images are what? If it's not really about the images, what are they for then? They have to be for something. Poe is a professional writer, right? He didn't randomly put this in. What do the images serve if they're not for anything particular, like you were saying? Not for anything particular. They do have a particular feeling, but not necessarily what's indicated here. They're a vehicle at the end of the day, right? They're meant to channel something much larger than themselves, right? But there is something that's stopping, right, the paintings. And that's, again, the sentence right before it. Beyond the power of the written words, okay? That's really the key element of this paragraph here. Okay? Now, why is this important? Come back to the original question that I asked you, right? We're talking about stories within stories, right? The narrator is telling the story to Roderick as part of a story that we are reading as literature students or just people, right? So why is this passage so important to the story? Hint, by the way, it happens right around the middle of the story, which should ding off little bells in your head of, the structure of narrative, right? A turning point of a narrative is something I'm sure you've all heard of in some way, shape, or form. It happens right around the middle of a paragraph. We'll talk about it later, but yeah, Adam, go ahead. You had something and then it deflated.
Like it's kind of like them is beyond the power of written words a bit of like I don't know prediction because the story is written.
Yep.
So like we're getting this information still. Like we wouldn't know this at all if it wasn't written already. And the idea of like in this scene specifically, like in this scene there was like they were like reading a story inside of a story. Mm-hmm. And since things were happening in real life, there was no need to actually describe it because it was actually happening.
Good, absolutely. Maiva, you had your hand up, and then Francesca.
Some look that whatever ending that either the story that the narrator was telling to us and the story that we are reading.
Francesca.
Goes back to the idea that the narrator his attempts at telling the story fall short
Mhm.
the actual horrors of the event. So he can't, the words that he has aren't adequate to describe what he could see, I guess.
Yeah.
And that gives the reader the mental jump to, I guess, imagine for themselves what could be present there, create a sense of fear and both wonder.
Anything else? Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of the methods of Lovecraft. What?
Lovecraft, yeah.
Lovecraft. Yeah, Lovecraft. Yeah, Lovecraft. Like the Lovecraft story of like explaining, but also not explaining by omission.
Mhm.
Like the monsters, like all the food, for example, which it's not in the Monsters of Madness, no?
No.
Yeah, no. It's from word. But yeah, like he never really describes anything, but instead leaves it up to the imagination,
Mhm.
which is also what like future like adaptations of his works did, because there's no actual description of it. We're left to like think what cosmic horrors were there.
So notice what Poe does here, okay? There are specific moments, even in the version of the story that I gave you on Studium and in the full version that I have, right, where he doesn't hesitate to give you details, right, about the world, okay? I'll leave you to find examples specifically. But then in the specific moments where he chooses to omit, right, details, and again, this is something that we talked about before the break, right? There are specifically chosen moments where he says, no, I cannot describe what is happening here, as you mentioned, or not that I cannot, I refuse as a writer to describe. Because as a writer, he clearly has the power to do it, right? He has the technical ability to write about what's being described, okay? So it's a choice at some point to say, no, you either do not get to engage in this horror, or I'm sparing you from the horror itself of what's happening, right? Which in itself is even more terrifying, right? And when we're talking about sensations that are created in literature, this is the type of stuff that you really need to be thinking about, right? What is said versus what isn't said, and why, okay? So, some of the things that are described, just right after, right? He does go on to describe a little bit of the painting itself. One of these pictures may be told, although weakly in words, it showed the inside of a room where the dead might be placed, with low walls, white and plain. It seemed to be very deep under the earth. There was no door, no window, and no light or fire burned. Yet a river of light flowed through it, filling it with horrible, ghastly brightness. Okay? This is a really good example of what we're talking about here, where Poe is simultaneously describing something, right? I'm sure you all have some minimal image of what he's describing here. He's, in essence, describing modernist poetry before modernism was a thing, modernist paintings before modernism was a thing, a very minimal and yet starkly evocative painting. But at the same time, there's a lack at the heart of this painting. What's missing from this painting? Good, a light source. Why does this matter? Yeah.
Because there's still a brightness in it. Like, where is it coming from?
Mm-hmm. Where is the light coming from? Okay. We can have a whole discussion about light, but I know it's already 2:30 and I want to move on to the yellow wallpaper as well, so we're not necessarily going to do that. But just to kind of cap off on this discussion of the House of Usher, this is something that, again, mirrors the story, right? What's lacking, or I'm not necessarily expecting an answer unless you have one off the top of your head, but this is something that you can actively consider. Is there something lacking or missing in the story that still has some kind of impact on the world? Okay. If anyone has an answer to that, go for it. But I think Poe's story does kind of get some of that, right? Right? He kind of indicates that there are things missing in the House of Usher in some ways, and yet somehow it's still standing. Something's still there, even though it's slowly dying, right? Yeah.
I guess you just never get an actual explanation.
Good.
like if things are implied, but nothing is actually explained. So like the actual answers could be anything you imagine.
Yeah.
Like it could be anything.
Good. I don't know if you had this part in the in the actual version that you had. There's a part towards the end of the story where he writes, "An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame. At length, there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. The term causeless alarm here is quite indicative. There's something having an impact on him, much like a light without a source, right? Something is changing the narrator's world, but even he doesn't know what it is." Good. Anything else we want to add about House of Usher before we move on to the yellow wallpaper? Okay, good. Do we want to take another break before we get to the yellow wallpaper, or just power through it and then finish a little bit earlier? Who wants to power through? Show of hands. Power through? All right, cool. Now, let me open up the yellow wallpaper and make sure that I have the exact same version as you all, because if I don't, I think I might throw myself out of this classroom. Okay. It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. Wow, I think this is the actual first success that I've had in this classroom. This is fantastic. Yeah, exactly. The feelings that I have. I don't know where they come from, but they're there. Okay, great. Let's start with the same thing here. What is the yellow wallpaper about? I think it's technically easier to define what exactly the yellow wallpaper is about as far as a narrative, but it's arguably a more bizarre and rich story than House of Usher. Okay? Yes, Francesca.
I guess it's mainly a story about how women lacked agency in their marriage and in medical issues that can be done.
Okay.
This is more the idea that she is isolated, alone, in a room for months on end for treatment that is supposed to help her, which seems to make her only fall into madness.
Okay, good. You're talking about the themes here. What's the actual story?
Well, I mentioned a bit of it.
A bit.
She's up in a room and she's going crazy.
Okay, why do we put her in a room? It's mentioned towards the beginning of the story-ish, but yeah, Alice and then Francesca.
Well, from what I understood, it's like she has postpartum depression.
Okay.
But her husband thinks it's just like nervous, like anxiety, something like that. So he puts her like in isolation, and then she just like goes with him.
Good. What's postpartum depression?
I mean, she just had a baby, and she was like feeling alone. She's not feeling well. She's like paranoid.
Maybe you had your hand up. Were you going to say the same thing? Or? Okay, Francesca, did you want to add anything? Okay, good. So, do we have a name for this main character? This narrator? Yeah.
There is no name, but towards the end, she does mention a name. She mentions the name Jane, and there are like theories whether she is Jane or there is another person that's.
Do you have a specific page, like towards what part? Or do you want to read out the section that you're talking about?
For the thing that you gave us, it's on the last page, page 15.
Okay. Oh yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she says, in spite of you and Jane, and I will also.
What do we think? Do we think she's Jane? Or is Jane someone else? Someone else? What makes us say someone else?
It didn't feel too first person enough.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Like it definitely felt like she was talking to like about someone else.
Mm-hmm.
The sentence formulation doesn't make sense for it to be first person.
Is there possibly a logic that would make it so that she is Jane? And that, yeah, go ahead and then Francesca.
Also saying that she's kind of like dissociated herself from herself, and yeah.
Okay, good. So there's a dissociation to the point where Jane is just imagined as someone else, even though it's actually her.
In spite of you and Jane.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how to explain it.
Take a minute to think about it, Francesca.
My understanding, because my copy says Jenny. I don't know.
There is a Jenny, but it's literally the last paragraph.
Okay. But I thought she was John's sister. Because they do mention at one point, because I believe the yellow wallpaper is like her writing in her diary. And she says, there comes John's sister, and I must not let her find me writing. So
Good. Yeah.
and the way that some stuff are written. So like I all that to say, John's sister.
Yeah. The diary element is an interesting one to consider, especially in relation to the House of Usher, right? The power of writing is one that I think we should generally consider. Right? And again, it's something that we need to think about whenever we're analyzing literature as a thing, right? We were talking about at the beginning of this class today how a lot of early literary criticism was concerned with what actually the power of text and literature is, right? And you can see still elements of this in the stories that we're talking about today, right? Poe referring to the text as being some way of expressing an incomprehensible feeling, but not quite, right? It only has a certain limit. And of course, in the yellow wallpaper, the narrator, maybe Jane, maybe someone else, thinking of a way to express her feelings and her ideas as a woman in the 19th century that's confined to a, funny enough, yellow room, right, who actually wants to write down these feelings as a way of expressing herself in some way, shape, and form. Good. Which, by the way, was like a very common thing for, well, not common, was one of the ways that women would typically do that throughout history, right? The novel, right? Does anyone know a little bit of the history of the novel as a form, right? And why that matters to women's writing specifically? Yeah, so the novel, by the way, started off as basically letters put together, right? If you look at those early novels from the 17th century, a lot of them were what now we call, what's the term for it? I'm sorry?
Is it, well, I know the words in French.
Yeah.
Like they correspond.
Yeah, it's kind of like correspondences, but there's a specific word for it in English that's escaping me. It starts with a
Latin.
No, it starts with a E. Epistolary. Thank you. Epistolary is the way that we talk about it, but right, which was typically something that was associated, right or wrong, with women, right? Women were often associated as the people who would write letters and correspond with one another. And those early novels were often written by women and were imitating, right, these correspondences as a way of making stories, right? Obviously, men did write novels and wrote epistolary novels as well. Although even the men who did write epistolary novels, for a long time, novels were considered a very womanly type of writing, right? And novels were specifically marketed towards women for that very reason. Especially early novels, although that would change somewhat, of course. Okay, now, of course, we talked about the house itself, right, in relation to the House of Usher. What can we say about the place that the narrator, Jane, we'll call her maybe Jane, in the yellow wallpaper? Where is she? What can we say about that place? Why does it matter to the story? How is it described? What kind of impact does it have on you? Why is it the thrust of the story? Unpack the yellow wallpaper itself, right, as an image. Yeah.
Could you just say the question again?
No.
Okay.
So when we think of the yellow wallpaper,
yeah.
right, the actual yellow wallpaper, right, and the place that she's in, what is important about it? Why is she in that place? Well, we already talked a little bit about why she's in that place, but what is the connection between the place itself and the story that's being told? Yeah, go ahead, and then Francesca.
She's basically just confined in this one room, or at least she's allowed to go in the house, but she's very, like, barely allowed to. But most of the time, her husband and her brother, a bit from the start of the story she mentioned.
Good.
And like that's the was it the husband's sister that was the maid?
Yeah.
Yeah. He tasked her like always making sure she stays in the room, like I get as much rest as possible, because they just didn't believe or even refused to believe. As like at one point, like because I remember at one point she tried to like talk about it, but then he just there's no such thing as that and all that. So he just refuses to believe she has something in her mind, which just makes it even worse. And by the end of the story, she just goes full crazy by just crawling around the room, following the gaps in the wallpaper.
Good.
Even going next, even when the husband what's the word? Collapses.
Yeah.
Collapses from this, just still continues doing it without minding it.
Absolutely, she kind of walked over his body. Yeah. Francesca, you had your hand up. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That could reflect that. When that also is reflected in the idea that he's a doctor.
Yeah.
So he's like, obviously, I know better than you about your own feelings and how, of course, I know that. But that the room, it reflects that, especially with the wallpaper. And I think the windows are barred, so it reflects the idea that she's stuck in.
Good. Absolutely. Does anyone know anything about Gilman's personal life? Yeah.
I think she herself went through that treatment at one point, and this might be wrong, but she actually wrote this to share her experience.
So I have here in my notes something that, tell me if this rings a bell. So in real life, Gilman was actually married to a person called Walter Stetson. And their marriage was typical of the 19th century, wherein it was kind of arranged and not really, it was kind of doomed from the start type of marriage. And Gilman herself actually went through postpartum depression, right? And I wrote here in my notes that Stetson had envisioned, quote unquote, domesticating his wife, rendering her humble, selfless, and dependent. A, quote, angel in the house rather than a, quote, reformer of the world, right? Because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, Gilman was a rather active feminist in her time. And these quotes come from Stetson's own writings. And eventually he did convince her to take a, quote unquote, cure. And Gilman herself, in her autobiography, wrote that she was, quote, fed, bathed, rubbed, and returned to her husband, Walter, with the following prescription. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you at all times. Lie down 1 hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours of intellectual life per day. And never touch a pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Does this sound familiar to anyone who perhaps read this story, right? So yes, I think, Francesca, you're absolutely correct. She did very much, she was very much inspired by her own experience as someone who did go through some kind of treatment. Yeah.
Treatments.
Yeah.
Where Mitchell.
What page are you on?
Well, my copy is page 12, but paper copy. But the quote is, John says, if I don't pick up faster, he shall send me to where Mitchell in the fall. Yeah. I forget where that is. But yes, absolutely. And it is interesting with that particular passage, the idea that you need to get back on your feet as quickly as possible, right? The point is ostensibly to heal this woman, the Gilman stand-in for the story, but at the same time, there is a sickening efficiency that's trying to be pushed onto the character. Absolutely. I put up a passage here. This is the first description of the wallpaper itself. And I think it really sums up a lot of the ways that we've been talking about it so far. Does anyone want to read the passage? Yes.
One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroying themselves at unheard of contradictions. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulfur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate myself if I had to live in this room long.
Okay, good. So obviously there's a few passages here that are rather indicative, right? The curves commit suicide, right? There's a rather evocative notion of not wanting to be on this plane of existence anymore. But there's also some rather interesting parallels, I think, to the House of Usher, right? What are some of the parallels that we can make with this passage and what we just talked about in Usher, right? Yeah.
There's a lot of it's very detailed,
Sure.
but also but just sort of the color being so faded is, of course, it feels very unnatural, specifically because of how she described it, like smoldering on clean yellow, lurid orange, and sickly sulfur. And these are very specific colors, in a very disgusting combination.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sickly aspect of it. What else? Think deeper. Is this a well-kept room? No. Okay. Why?
Because of the stains.
Okay, yeah, the stains. It seems to be cracked in some areas, like the wallpaper itself doesn't seem to be maintained properly. I know wallpaper is no longer like a very common thing to have in today's households. I would be very surprised if any one of you have had wallpaper in their homes. You had to kind of like maintain it in order for it to be proper, which is why it sucked, because you had to actually maintain your walls. But it's something that you had to take care of, right? And actually put some effort into upkeeping. Which, of course, there's a quite clear parallel here with what we were talking about with Usher, right? The maintaining of family relations or family dynamics or personal health, right, and care reflected in the environment and the world around us, which, of course, Gilman is raising here. What do we make of that first sentence, though? One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. Yeah.
It doesn't work together.
What do you mean?
In a way that it's not aesthetically pleasing as how an artist should make something that's nice to look at. It just very, very, it's like it just came together randomly, like a random assortment of different patterns, different colors and all that. It just made something very disgusting and unpleasant.
Yeah. In I think the most, to use a more contemporary term, it seems like she's describing kitsch, right? Or what we would call kitsch today. You know what I'm talking about when I say kitsch, right? It's something that you look at and you're like, who made this? Who is this for, right? This is clearly for no one, and it's clearly the most horrendous thing I've ever seen in my life, right? And yet, the intention behind it is clearly aesthetic in some way, right? Clearly, it's supposed to be pleasing for someone, otherwise it wouldn't have been made. And so I think you're right in saying that there is this contradiction between something that was spawned into this world, and yet, for all intents and purposes, should not exist, right? Yeah.
Also, I think this is a nursery.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be for children to look at,
Good.
Which makes it worse.
Yeah. It's not exactly what we would imagine a child to live in, right? Especially, well, obviously today in the 19th century is not the same thing, but today when we have a child's bedroom, what's in it? It's happy little dancing clouds or whatever the fuck, right? And, toys and pastel blues I'm sorry? Yeah, teddy bears, right? Bunnies, not, artistic aberrations, or however you want to call them. Okay. One of the last things I want to raise, of course, is what comes out of the wallpaper. What does she see in the wallpaper? So this is the first description. Maybe someone other than Adam. You're doing great, Adam. Don't worry. But what exactly does the narrator see from the wallpaper? Yeah.
She starts seeing a woman trapped behind the wallpaper. It's kind of a reflection of the way she is trapped in the house or in the room, and she tries to read her from the wall.
Absolutely. Again, make a parallel here with Usher. What's the connection here? I'm not saying here that Gilman is specifically referencing Poe. I don't think but I think she is channeling similar ideas in many ways. So what's the connection here between the woman in the wallpaper and perhaps something like the House of Usher? Yeah, go ahead. Anyone.
No, I thought not.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not too sure, but I just rewatched what we have analyzed in the House of Usher. The line, if ever a man painted an idea, that man was Project Usher. And the line where she found a woman behind, in a way, isn't the part where each characters that are mentally sick are stuck in a room, there's a reflection of themselves within their environment. Usher is Roderick Usher is for him is the house and like all the spooky elements. Whereas for our narrator here is the woman behind the paper walls of her room.
I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Alice, were you going to say something? Okay, good.
There's also the part where like she's was talking to the woman behind the wallpaper, and then we remember like the sister of Usher. She tried to escape the like room, and they heard noises.
Thank you for bringing up the sister. Okay. What do we do with the sister, or what does Roderick and the narrator do with the sister?
They lock her.
Right, lock her in a basement-ish while she's still alive, right? Pretending that she's dead, right? Well, pretending-ish. That she's dead, right? It's good. Yeah.
Actually, to know something.
Please.
During the 19th century, wasn't it common that at the time sometimes they buried accidentally people alive, and so this is like a tiny little hint.
Yes, but also I think the implication in House of Usher specifically is that Roderick is insane, and it's like the house that's making her seem dead, or like warping their reality rather than them actually. Yeah, go ahead.
So then that's when Roderick imprisoned his sister and within the walls of the Usher's house out of madness.
Maybe pushing it? I don't know. What do you all think? I think there's an interesting parallel there, right? Because I don't think, again, maybe I don't know what Poe's intention was, because I've never read anything about him writing it. But I do think the parallel is interesting of like hiding a person, right, or capturing a person within the confines of a collapsing home. I think there's an interesting parallel to make there. I don't know. I'm kind of launching the idea out there. We'll make whatever we make of it. Maybe I'm pushing it a little bit too far. But I find that idea interesting, or at least there's a thematic undertone that seems to be paralleling here. Francesca, you have a frown on your face, and I'm not sure if it's a malignant frown or...
Because I was kind of thinking like prophetic.
Yeah, okay. Say more.
I was just comparing it to what I was thinking about Poe's, where a lot of the narrator's thoughts did seem prophetic at time as well, because he would think things that were eerie and creepy, like that will happen, and then it would kind of happen. So, but that is also the Gothic genre, I guess.
Okay, good. So I see that it's almost 3 here. I wanted to finish off with some ideas. So we've talked about some elements of both of these stories, right? Both of these stories came out right on the cusp of the 20th century, right? 1890s, both of them. The exact years I cannot remember. I think both came out in 1896, 1880s, 1890s, something like that. Very much towards the end of the century. Now, obviously, it falls a little bit outside of our timeline, right? But as far as we've read so far, right, with the Nieville text and the Vandermeer text, would we qualify this as something like weird fiction, right? Based on what we've read so far of people trying to define weird fiction? Or would we still categorize it as part of what we understand the Gothic to be, right? Arguments for and against go. Yeah.
I'd say yes. We could consider it weird fiction.
Okay, say more. Why?
It's because they're all like both stories are things that are mentioned in a way and written in a way that they're technically real. Like they can be real and probably are like have represented real, or especially with the yellow wallpaper, like with the offer's life and all that. But they're written in a way, explained in a way that makes them feel very unnatural and very indirect, especially with House of Usher, of like how the house physically collapses and how the sister and how Usher and his sister just completely lose their mind. But in reality, they probably just like died because of the generations and generations of inbreeding just caused too much too many deformities in the idea.
Okay.
So I would consider it weird because it's just very uncanny, but with a maybe.
Okay. So, but isn't that your own description kind of goes against the weird, right? Because what kind of is it possible that someone dies and their house collapses around them?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, but like, I guess not that I'm saying, because in this case, it's not the house that collapsed and he died. He died and then the house collapsed, right? It's not the same thing in this case. If the house had collapsed and then killed Frederick, yes, then that would actually make sense in the context of the real world, right? But there is that unnatural element, I think, that makes it. In my mind, I'm still thinking Gothic, and the reason I'm still thinking Gothic is that. For me, both the house and the room are like ghosts, right? Or ghostly figures, right? And I'm willing to like get disagreements here from people. I'm just launching how most interpretations of these stories have taken place, and I find them personally convincing. But a lot of the stories or interpretations of something like Usher have been that the house itself is the monster, right? In the Dracula or Ghost or Frankenstein's creature sense, right? It's something that actively haunts and impacts as a singular thing, right, over the main character. Right? Whereas, and in the case of the yellow wallpaper, and then I saw your hand, Alice, it's the ghost of presumably previous women who have been in this house or in that room, right, that is haunting the narrator in some way, shape, or form. Yes, go for it.
Personally, I would actually disagree.
Go for it. Yeah, please.
For example, the first story, for like almost like the whole story, we think it's a ghost, and at the end we realize that it's just the sister, and then they both die. But I think that the house collapsing could be related to like the wind and the storm that was happening, because it was already like on collapse.
Yeah.
And then maybe like just the wind was what helped.
Yeah.
And for the other story, it was just like she's gone completely mad, and then she was like just seeing this not ghosts.
Yeah.
But that's like my take.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Again, I think it's like more in the weird room because like the house and the wallpaper are very concrete shapes, not supernatural things.
Okay.
But I feel the characters make of it and how it impacts them, not the supernatural.
So the fact that it is based in some kind of reality does make it weird for you. Okay. Good. Maeva and then Adam.
Both of the novels that we just saw, stories that I saw, are rightfully so part of their original genre.
Topic. Yeah.
Yeah. But I can say that why there's a relation between the weird literature and Gothic literature. Well, in Gothic literature, we can say that there are a few elements that can refer to the weird.
Yeah.
For example, in the House of Usher, there's the potential gap that could have existed during the narration. You feel it with when the narrator was reading a story to his friend, while telling the story, it was exactly what was happening while we're reading. So since in the weird literature, we have to fill in a way the gaps.
Okay. So I was about to say, like, what are the gaps in some ways that are? But okay, I think you kind of approach that in an interesting way. Yeah, Adam.
The stories that's very like, the way I saw the stories and I appreciate the stories that they're very figurative.
Mm-hmm.
Like just coming back on what I said, what's happening is like what's happening was also like reading like what she's reading reading between the lines. Like even during the whole class, like we read between the lines of what's happening, like the supposed incest, about her like postpartum.
Yeah.
That's like the way the stories are so like I feel they're vehicles to represent to like explain like those real life situations that have like even Edgar Allan Poe probably like had a friend that either went through like something similar or just he's heard of this story like of this situation a lot and so like inspired him to write it in this way like I still like maybe a sort of personal criticism that wasn't very apparent.
Yeah.
And the yellow wallpaper, it's of course like it's a representation of her own like story of like what she went through. Yeah, like where like the woman in the wallpaper is just like the hallucinations, like her going increasingly insane, especially with the end, which just tears everything apart.
I think, yeah, Poe especially. I don't know if you knew anyone. Poe certainly went through some own difficulties mental health wise in his own life. For those of you who don't know, he did face significant issues with addiction himself, and money problems and all kinds of stuff that made him probably not the healthiest person mentally speaking. But I do think that the element of gaps that we were talking about is definitely present in those stories. I think that's that's particularly true. As we go forward, right, we're going to be reading stories that definitely that there's very little debate as to whether or not they are part of the weird, right? And already next week, I think part of the exercise that you should do for yourselves as you're starting to read At the Mountains of Madness is to wonder what makes the way that Lovecraft or someone like Lovecraft is writing, right, versus how someone like Poe or someone like Gilman was writing, right? What are the differences in the engagement specifically with that quote unquote gap, right? Because I think you're all correct in saying that, yeah, it's especially evident in the yellow wallpaper that the cracks in the home tell a story, right? Or motivate the story in some way, shape, or form. That is absolutely true. But at what point they form an integral or a necessary or a complete part of the story, I think is where we maybe have a distinction to make between Gothic and weird. Okay. Something else to notice for next week. Okay, so next week we're going to start reading At the Mountains of Madness. If you haven't bought it or haven't got a copy, please do so. There's copies at the library, at the Jambria. If you get a copy at Jambria, you'll at least ensure that you have the same copy as I do. I'm using the Penguin Modern Classics. So Penguin Modern Classics. So if you're looking for a digital copy or anything like that, this is what the cover looks like. I think this is the version that's also available at the Jean-Briand bookstore. That's how. Okay. So as far as I'm aware, there are no different versions of At the Mountains of Madness. But as the last two classes have made perfectly clear to me, I apparently know diddly squat about different versions of texts. So I might be wrong. As far as I know, there are no two different versions. So go with that at your own risk. I'm reading this copy, or I have read this copy. And yeah, I'll be quite clear, right? You'll find a lot of references in At the Mountains of Madness. Okay, there are some explicit references to Poe, right? Not Fall of the House of Usher. He doesn't reference that story specifically, but he does refer to other Poe tales. But he also refers to artists, visual artists specifically, painters that were very well known at the time. And I think it's interesting for you to consider, as part of what we were talking about today in class, why those references are important. Why Lovecraft is specifically putting his influences out in the public like that, and actually using them to elaborate on a story unlike very few people had seen before at that time. Okay? So think about that. I think that's going to be very important. But in line with what we started talking about today and what we're actively going to be talking about next week, while you're reading At the Mountains of Madness, I want you to actively think about how it produces feelings in you, right? Like, obviously there's going to be a sense of dread, right? Or excitement or any kind of feelings that are going to be evoked in the story, right? Because that's the whole point. But I want you to examine the text and say, what specifically about this is evoking a particular sentiment in me, right? Is it my own understanding of the text? Is it my own context? Is it specific words on the page, right? There's all kinds of things that can actually influence how we read a text. And that's going to be super important for next week. Are we good? Another way of thinking about this, and this is just a way to cap off what we've talked about, Has anyone here actually seen the adaptation of The Fall of the House of Usher that they did on Netflix a few years ago at this point? Francesca, you did. If anyone wants a good idea or a good not condensation, like I guess like bringing together of a lot of the ideas that we've talked about so far. It has the title of The Fall of the House of Usher, but it's not an actual adaptation of the story, right, that we read today. Rather, the story that we read today in the adaptation becomes what we call a frame narrative, right? It's what structures the story that's being told, but what's really interesting about the TV show, and I think it's really excellent, is that each episode is a different adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe story. So it adapts The Raven, The Black Cat, what's the one about the plague, the Mask of the Red Death, right? Like it keeps adapting different ones and connects them through the lens of The Fall of the House of Usher, right? As a story about the collapse of a family, right? So if you want a good sense of how stories reinterpret themselves and find new meanings throughout time, I gave the example of Nosferatu earlier, but the actual adaptation of the story that we discussed today is also a really good example of that. So if anyone has Netflix, or if you have legal abilities to find movies and TV shows online, I do highly recommend that TV show. But be warned, it is extremely graphic and violent, but it's fantastic as a show. Last thing, we're going to be talking about At the Mountains of Madness for 2 weeks. Right? It's not a very long story. It's about 100 pages long, a bit over 100 pages. But don't be stressed about whether or not you've actually finished the story for next week. Read at least half of it just to get a good sense. But if you haven't finished it, it's not the end of the world. We're going to be talking about it for 2 weeks. Okay? Come to me if you have any questions. Don't forget that you can give in your reviews anytime.